Hello, my name is Stott. I'm the Executive Chairman of the ManSat Group of Companies, and thank you for allowing me to speak today at the Von Braun Symposium. And sincere thanks to Carol Lane, Jim Ray, and also Alan DeLuna, especially Alan, for inviting me to speak. I'm going to be talking briefly on change in the satellite industry and how that affects us all of us in space. Change is the only constant. We live in incredible times. High schoolers putting experiments on the space station. Universities routinely launching CubeSats. We're landing on asteroids. Flybys of Pluto, robots the size of SUVs driving around Mars, and we're returning to the moon, finally. Thank you, NASA. We live in a time where every piece of human knowledge is available at the touch of a button. We live in times when no one need ever be alone again. Satellite communications now reach every corner of the world. The space industry is beyond global. Never forgetting, though, that 100% of the money spent in space isn't. It's spent down here in our economies. As Robert Jacobson says, space is not just a destination, it's an industry. And more importantly, it's an industry in transition, where in satellite communications, we are moving from the economics of scarcity into the economics of abundance. Exponential change has come to satellite, which means it's come to space. Now, exponential change and disruption is the nice name for it. What we're experiencing are the brutal economic shocks and shudders of the second industrial revolution, this second renaissance, this digital renaissance. At the forefront of this change is connectivity, and it affects every one of us as individuals, and it is driving profound change in satellite. Digital data is driving this change. With sincere thanks to Steve Jurvetson, one of the most profound thinkers and great drivers of the space industry today, also, of course, Dr. Ray Kurzweil and Dr. Peter Diamandis, this wonderful chart. You've probably seen it before. If you know this already, forgive me. But we're talking about Moore's law and its impact upon computing. Faster computers making faster computers, as Dr. Diamandis says. But what we don't always think about is how Moore's law is impacting other associated industries. Things like 3D printing, big data, biotech, material sciences, machine learning. And some of these industries are moving at a faster pace than Moore's law itself. And it's driving change across the board. Now, we tend to think of this in terms of computers, that Moore's law started with computers. But what we're realizing is that this exponential change had started eons ago when humans first started to speak and write. This is a journey we've been on for a long time, and now we are witnessing some of the incredible fruits of what this change can bring. Smartphones are the embodiment of this change. I've got my smartphone here with me. Wonderful phone. I look at this and I can see immediately three ways that this relates to space. GPS, last mile connectivity. Don't forget your phone doesn't work without satellites. And also mapping, remote sensing. It's incredible. And there's a lot more that's going on here too in the space industry. This one device is driving such change. Well, think about it. Every 2 years, there's a new iPhone. Every 2 years, data needs increase exponentially. Not just for one person, but for every person, everybody, every device around the world. Now, in 2020, according to the International Telecommunications Union, there were 4.1 billion smartphones in action, representing 53% of the human population. And they're growing. And that's just the people. In 2020, there were 20 billion Internet of Things, IoT devices already online. By 2025, we're conservatively anticipating 75 billion such devices being active. And all of them need connectivity to drive their thirst for digital data. And why is this important? Because it's driving such change in the satellite industry, and satellite is space. Now, never forget, the satellite industry is a place where we commercially build, launch, and operate spacecraft and make money from them. Right? It's a healthy business. It is the communications backbone for the entire human race, and we feed into that larger space economy of the communications industry. How much so? I'll give you a brief example. NASA's budget in 2020 was $22.629 billion. It's an incredibly healthy budget. The satellite industry gross in 2020 was $423 billion. But our suppliers are your suppliers. Our costs are your costs, from launches to spacecraft to payloads to instruments to ground systems, all the way through to finance, insurance, workforce, policy, and more. All of this is being driven by data, and data itself, of course, isn't just hardware, it's software. So never forget that element too. We tend to look at space and we see the rockets, the capsules, and the satellites. But what we need to be looking at is the software, because we are now living and working in the software-defined age. We're living and working in a software-defined industry. Hardware changes, but the software survives, thrives, and drives. And also in satellite and space, our people are your people. We draw from the same talent pool, universities and more, especially ISU, International Space University. So what we do impacts everyone in space. And this is arguably a good thing. Why? It can benefit space exploration. Cheaper spacecraft, cheaper launch equals more missions, equals an abundance of space science. When you look at satellite, think of lessons learned. As goes satellite, goes space. Now, communications was the first to commercialize, followed by remote sensing, then human spaceflight. So we have lessons that are learned in every aspect of the space industry, from contracting to financing, to strategies on procurements, how to handle space debris. And so you have the luxury of looking at us and seeing where we've gone. A lot of the young entrepreneurs coming into the industry are doing just that, and it's paying huge dividends. Like I said, look at the space industry, look at the satellite industry. We're one and the same, and learn from our examples. And thanks to NASA, SpaceX, Blue Origin, Explore, and a whole range of companies, space is sexy again. I hope you realize, and it's a wonderful time, that we are experiencing the greatest influx of new young graduate talent into the space industry since the Apollo program. Note also, a great indicator of this data I'm talking about, this connectivity, is broadband connectivity from space. The advent of high throughput satellites, driven by demand. This is market pull, not tech push. We can't build them fast enough. We're now on second generation satellites, very high throughput satellites with more coming. It's not the end of GEO like you hear. It's just a moment of fleet replenishment, coupled with a new market model of abundance. It's not your parents' satellite broadband anymore. It's also edge of network data centers in space. Note, the last few weeks we've seen news on Microsoft working with Viasat, SES, and Starlink with SpaceX, AWS too, Amazon Web Services. So putting edge of network data centers in space, not just communicating, driven by data. Satellites are now software-driven servers in the sky, moving digital data around the Earth for both people and machines. I mean, Starlink alone, according to press reports, is an edge of network data center in orbit with over 32,000 Linux servers planned to be in space. I think over about 4,000 at the time of giving this talk are in space at the moment. The cloud is moving into space to meet demand. The last few weeks also highlight this positive change. By the way, we have iPads on space station, so why not the moon too? Great move, NASA. Thank you. With Intuitive Machines and Nokia, 4G on the moon, it's incredible. Again, scarcity becomes abundance. You don't need to recreate a communication system. You already have one, and they work great in space, thanks to the work of Chris Bezecki and Will Marshall and Robbie Schindler and others and NASA Ames. I probably forgetting people's names I should mention. Dr. Warden, hello. Putting smartphones in space, leading this incredible revolution. Scarcity becomes abundance by leveraging the advantage of this digital renaissance. Well, once space technology was the driving force, now we have this huge digital renaissance to draw upon to push us forward as well. Smartphones on the moon. Awesome. Kudos. Kudos too to those at NASA, Icon and Big for the 3D printing project from Mount Olympus. Olympus Base. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, Olympus. It just trips off the tongue. It's wonderful. Down at the South Lunar Pole. But my goodness, I think it was Marshall Space Flight Center, Johnson, and brought in Icon and Big. I mean, by the way, Bjarke Ingels is a rock star architect, arguably the finest architect in the world. And you brought him to NASA. You made him a part of the moon program, and the results are stupendous. Martin Volk and the team there working at Big with Bjarke. Wow. I get tongue-tied. It is amazing. Abundance, exponential tech, 3D printing on the moon. Wow. But there's one common factor in all this change that is often overlooked. And that's that we get from scarcity to abundance through regulation. The greatest enabler of exponential change, this digital renaissance, this acceleration, is regulation. We're talking about changes in spectrum, market access, and more. Those nations that adapt their regulations to embrace this change, to usher it in with an economic impetus, thrive. Now, how are we addressing this in the satellite industry? Geeks Without Frontiers. Community Connect, every major satellite company in the world has been changing satellite regulation, landing rights, market access, working with the government of Brazil all the way through to governments in Africa and Europe, fundamental change in blanket licensing and more to allow digital transformation to take place. At the World Bank, working with a range of nations from Jordan to Thailand and Afghanistan, and working on Dig Once, also working here with the FCC on rural broadband and more resilience in Houston and Harris County. It's great. Digital renaissance and resilience doesn't work without enabling laws and regulations. The government is that ultimate third force in ensuring the transition of one economic model to the next. The work of the FCC is fantastic. They are leading the world in this, in rural broadband, all the way through to the changes in the allocation of spectrum in the C-band, opening up 5G to the United States as a shining example to the rest of the planet with the C-band auctions and more, and a fundamental example of good governance, good regulation. The FCC should be amazingly commended for their superb work in this area. Equally, NASA with the Artemis Accords, as Dr. Del Smith says, the greatest example of the application of the rule of law in recent history. The Artemis Accords enabling the rule of law in space, enabling the very survival of the human race. The Artemis Accords stand as a virtuous statement of sanity versus the virtual suicide pact of the Moon Treaty, enabling the exponential exploration of the future. Thank you, NASA. Thank all involved. You're an inspiration to us all. So what happens when abundance comes to planetary science? 2015 paper from the International Institute of Space Commerce talked about the private provision of public science, the idea of engaging private capital in the provision of science. Same manufacturers, same launch vehicles, same primary investigators, different sources of capital, the ultimate benefactor being the taxpayer and the scientist. Companies like Explore are paving the way in this regard. And what happens when abundance meets space exploration and space science? It's more science, more exploration, at less cost, allowing even more science, right? It's abundant exploration. So we see NASA working with the world's #1 architect and startup companies to 3D print on the moon. NASA working with the world's leading telecommunications companies to put 4G on the moon. NASA working with cutting-edge startups like Explore to bring back exponential data from space. The CLIPS missions, literally this time next year, more science on the surface of the moon. Wow. What happens when you apply that to Mars? Incredible opportunities await. Abundance in planetary science, abundance in astronomy. What happens is that we're finally going back to the moon and then to Mars, leveraging these exponential technologies, leveraging this digital renaissance. And we couldn't do it without the membership of the AAS, We couldn't do it without the satellite industry, but especially we couldn't do it without NASA. Thank you, NASA. You're inspiring us all. And thank you too for inviting me to speak. My best wishes.